the moderator for today's event. So before we start, I would like to invite everyone to have a quick prayer based on your personal beliefs. Prayers begin. Thank you. So I would like to start by introducing Dr. Natali Pearson. Dr. Pearson, do you want to have a quick greeting to everyone participating today?
Certainly. Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm a member of ICOMOS Australia, so it's really nice to be invited to ICOMOS Indonesia. Thank you for having me. And I can see some friends in the audience, Shanatria, Southeast Asian Museum Services, and my new friend Ratri. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
Okay, wonderful. So I will quickly go through our agenda for today. We will start by the introduction of Dr. Pearson, and then we will continue to Dr. Pearson's presentation, and we will end this event by question and answer. We aim to finish the event at 3:30 p.m. Indonesian time. So Dr. Natali Pearson is a critical heritage studies scholar and an award-winning educator at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, the University of Sydney, where she is affiliated with the discipline of archaeology. Her research focuses on maritime heritage in Southeast Asia. Dr. Pearson's first book, Belitung, The Afterlives of a Shipwreck, is published by University of Hawaii Press and NUS Press. She is president of the Indonesia Council, a council of the Australian Institute of Maritime Archaeology, and host of the internationally syndicated SSEAC Stories podcast. So without any further ado, I would like to present to Dr. Natali. Dr. Natali, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, good morning. And I would also like to extend my thanks to Ratri Wulandari, who I met at University of Western Australia in February, and who invited me to give this talk today. And also would like to extend my thanks to Pak Suhardi, who is president of ICOMOS Indonesia. Oh, he's just joined, so that's terrific. Thank you. I know Friday is an important day in the Indonesian calendar for many of you, especially during Ramadan. So thank you all for taking the time to join this seminar today. Hello, Pak Suhardi. I can see you've just turned your video on.
Yeah. Hi, Natali. Sorry, I just completed my earlier meeting.
Sure.
So thank you so much for coming. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for having me. I was just saying that I'm a member of ICOMOS Australia, and it's great to be talking to colleagues at ICOMOS Indonesia and connecting with you. So it's really, yeah, I'm looking forward to the presentation and also the questions and discussion afterwards. So
all right.
let me see if I can share my screen.
Yeah. Thank you.
So see if it's hey, that's the wrong one. Sorry. I will try and share the different screen. How's that looking?
It looks fine.
Can you see my notes or just the screen?
The notes and the
Can
screen.
see your notes, yeah.
Let me display settings. How's that?
Yeah, wonderful.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, good. After 4 years of Zoom, I finally know how to do it. Okay, let's get started. So I'm going to be talking today about history of commercial shipwreck salvage in Indonesia, something I've been researching for a couple of years, but I appreciate that there are people in the room who are experts on this. So I really welcome your feedback, comments, updates, whatever you want to share at the end of the seminar. And I believe there's also a chat box. So if you want to pop questions in there during the seminar, that's also fine. As Kemuning mentioned, I'm a critical heritage studies scholar at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. We're a multidisciplinary centre. So I work with colleagues across the university in law and geography and public health. But as a researcher, I'm interested in heritage, and my particular area of interest is shipwrecks in Indonesia. It's a very specific research topic, and maritime heritage in Southeast Asia more broadly. So I'm interested in what shipwrecks and other types of maritime heritage can tell us about the past, and the histories and the trade routes and you know, these sort of normative questions we can ask about maritime archaeology. But I'm equally interested in what shipwrecks can tell us about the present, in terms of how they are being used as part of broader political, strategic and geocultural narratives in our region, Southeast Asia. So when I'm talking today about the history of commercial shipwreck salvage in Indonesia, I want to try to link it back to the role that maritime heritage plays within broader expressions of national identity within Indonesia. And in particular, how shipwrecks both reflect and express Indonesia's vision for itself as a globally significant maritime nation, poros maritim dunia. As you might be aware, Indonesia's approach to shipwreck management has really varied over the years, over the decades. In the 1980s, there was no formal protection whatsoever of shipwrecks. Then there was a period of legalized commercial salvage through the 1990s and the early 2000s. And during this time, 50% of the cargo went to the government and 50% went to the commercial salvage company. Then in 2010, a moratorium was introduced on commercial shipwreck salvage. That was a temporary moratorium that became permanent in 2016. But then the Omnibus Law was introduced in 2020, and that changed everything. This Cipta Kerja Law, job creation law, and that again changed the legislative landscape in so many ways, including as it related to shipwrecks. So these legislative changes over the past 40 years or so are a response to and a reflection of Indonesia's conflicted attitude towards heritage and the role that heritage can play within broader visions of Indonesia as a maritime nation. What we see is a very ambiguous and at times contradictory attitude towards the management of shipwrecks in Indonesian waters. And this back and forth for whether they should be treasured as cultural heritage or valued as treasure, as an economic like fish or seabed mineral that can be extracted and commodified. So this equivocating over how maritime heritage is to be valued in Indonesia has led to some criticism of Indonesia by the international community. And while some of this is perhaps warranted, I think a far more interesting question is what this ambiguity tells us about the tensions in Indonesia about its own maritime identity. You know, and I'm really conscious I'm speaking to Indonesians here, so I really do want to hear your thoughts about my ideas in terms of how maritime heritage relates to expressions of national identity in Indonesia. So as much as shipwrecks can offer us insights into global trading networks and ancient connections across the seas, I'm more interested in thinking with shipwrecks in an Indonesian context and how they can shed light on contemporary domestic and international issues. How different ministries and even different politicians can exercise power, how Indonesia positions itself on the world stage, and the politics of heritage in the world's greatest archipelago. So we can't avoid looking at legislation talk, I'm afraid, but I have tried to keep it to a minimum. So what I thought I would do is introduce you to some case studies first, and I've chosen these because they exemplify some of the different management approaches to shipwrecks over the decades. And then I will talk about the regulatory context, both globally and within Indonesia. And then pose some questions about how maritime heritage is valued in Indonesia. I have listed the three case studies that I'm going to be looking at. So the first one is if you've heard me speak about Belitung before, I apologize. You might be familiar with some of the content at the beginning of this talk. But it is an important shipwreck when we're thinking about commercial because it exemplifies the differences between the international community's approach and Indonesia's approach to managing shipwrecks. Then I want to talk about the World War II shipwrecks in Indonesian waters. Now, they're interesting because they're conflict heritage, they're difficult heritage, but they're of particular interest to me because of the illicit salvaging of these wrecks for scrap metal and the impact on the bilateral relationship between the flag state, whether it's Australia or the Netherlands or England, and the coastal state, Indonesia. And the challenges of managing these wrecks, which are very sensitive, many of them have human remains on them, and they're difficult to manage both in policy and in practice. I also want to mention SS Aquila, which some of my Indonesian colleagues introduced me to recently. And this is quite an interesting shipwreck because it's located in waters in Ambon Bay, which is operated by Pertamina, the national oil and gas company. So it really brings into tension heritage and resources and development. Then, as I said, we'll turn to the regulatory context. There's a lot of legislation. If you're really interested in it, you can read my article about it, but it's very detailed and complicated and contradictory, in fact. So I'm going to turn now to the shipwreck case studies, the first one being the Belitung. And this is a significant ship for historians, for art historians, for maritime archaeologists. As you can see in this quote by John Guy, who's a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, this was a really standout, significant event, the discovery of this shipwreck in 1998. The Belitung is also known as Tung shipwreck. It's been renamed the Tung shipwreck, but I call it Belitung because it was found near Belitung Island. Hope you can see this map. You would be familiar with Sumatra and Bangka Belitung province, and this is the location where Belitung was found, named after the island. It was found at, it's just 2 miles or so, 2 nautical miles offshore and about 17 meters deep. There are a number of other shipwrecks, or indeed many other shipwrecks in these waters, and a number have been salvaged. And in fact, the Bacau was being salvaged when news started to come through of a reef where jars are growing. And the commercial salvage company that was working on the Bacau moved their site to Belitung once they saw what was coming out of the water from the Belitung shipwreck. A number of other wrecks that are of significance as well, but probably don't have time to go into those today. We'll just focus on Belitung. So this is Belitung Island, the famous Batu Hitam, black rocks that Belitung Island is known for. In fact, the shipwreck was first called the Batu Hitam when it was first found, then it became Belitung. And these name changes are also very interesting to me in terms of how people claim a wreck through naming. So as I mentioned, there was a commercial shipwreck salvage company operating on Belitung Island in the 1990s. They were working with local fishermen to hunt for shipwrecks, I suppose, in their waters, to get commercial permits to survey for shipwrecks, and if they found one, they would then apply for a permit to salvage them. So they, as is often the case with shipwrecks, they heard about this first through the local fishers who had been looking for trepang and found this reef where jars were growing. And here we see some of the ceramics that were on board, an estimated 70,000 ceramics on board. These are the ceramics from Changsha in China, and here they are fresh out of the water and being rinsed before being taken to shore. So this is these are the bowls on display, the Changsha bowls on display. The ship was the cargo was recovered over 2 seasons, over about 4 months in total, with a break at the end of 1998, early 1999 for the monsoon. And after years of conservation and marketing, the bulk of the objects were eventually sold to Singapore, where they are now on permanent display at the Asian Civilizations Museum. And as I mentioned, they have been renamed the Tung shipwreck. So the bulk of the cargo was ceramics. These bowls from Changsha constituted the bulk of the ceramics. There were also beautiful objects from the kilns of Gongxian, this experimental green and white splashedware, for example, and some marvelous pieces of gold. As I mentioned, it was sold to Singapore in around 2004, and Singapore was interested in it for tourism purposes, and originally it was purchased by the Tourism Authority and only later transferred to the National Heritage Board. I've chosen this picture of Singapore because this is the museum where they first went on temporary display. And Singapore purchased, I mentioned there were 70,000 objects on board approximately, that's an estimate. They recovered 60,000 and 53,227 were sold to Singapore. So 7,000 objects missing, I'll come back to those. But Singapore paid $32 million for the 53,000 objects. And this temporary exhibition at the Art Science Museum down at Marina Bay Sands was part of a strategy of displaying a few of the objects while Singapore figured out where they would go permanently and what museological and historical narrative they would fit into. So eventually Singapore came up with this idea to develop an international travelling exhibition, partnering with the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, and the objects were to go on display first at the Art Science Museum and then travel to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, DC, and then go around the world. This exhibition, this beautiful catalogue that you see on the right, was published in 2011, but it was at the same time that a controversy erupted around the means by which these objects had been recovered. So, as I mentioned, they were commercially salvaged, but there were archaeologists in America who said that even though it might be technically legal, it served to blur the distinction between genuine maritime archaeology and treasure hunting. So Indonesia had domestic legislation that said it was okay to commercially salvage objects, and the objects had been recovered under permit in Indonesia, but nevertheless, the international community disagreed with this approach, and what ended up happening is that the exhibition was cancelled. The Smithsonian Institution cancelled the exhibition and really caused a lot of headaches for the Singaporean authorities in figuring out how they would manage the objects from that point forward. The criticisms were many, so I've listed a number of them here. First of all, the main criticism, or one of the main criticisms, was a lack of methodical data collection. So because they had been recovered so quickly, some 60,000 objects over just 4 months or so, there hadn't been an opportunity to gather methodical data on each and every object. One of the other criticisms was that the hull had been left in situ. Now, this was actually a condition of the salvage permit. The Indonesian government had requested that the commercial salvage company leave the hull in situ. It was concreted. It would have been hard to get out. I'm not sure it would have survived recovery. But nevertheless, that was not attempted because the Indonesian authorities wanted to develop the site as a tourist spot by leaving the hull as something that people could dive and learn more about the past. Unfortunately, the hull was destroyed as a result of the looting that took place on the wreck, and also because of the shipworms, the mollusks, teredo worms that eat timber. There were also criticisms that some of the ceramic sherds had been buried in sand because they had no commercial value, unlike the intact objects. That looting took place during and after the commercial salvage activities. And again, this distinction between commercial salvage for profit and maritime archaeological excavation for science. So it was legal, but it wasn't ethical. This was the criticism. Now, I thought I had updated that. That picture is actually Michael Flecker's, not Ian McCann's. But that's a picture of the anchor, which is now missing. Yet another criticism around what happened to the anchor. So I mentioned that Singapore had bought 53,000 of the objects. And one of the discussion points around this wreck is that, look, it's a largely intact assemblage. It's on display in a public museum. It's good enough. But I just want to problematize this idea of the intact assemblage, because as I said, there were about 70,000 objects on board. About 60,000 were salvaged. So this means about 10,000 objects were left on the seabed. These were sherds, fragments, concreted lead ingots. Singapore purchased 53,227 of the objects that were recovered. So this is what is in the Singapore collection, the Tongue Shipwreck collection, managed by the National Heritage Board. And as you can see, the vast bulk of the collection is ceramics. Now that leaves about 7,000 objects, which were seized by Indonesian authorities and remain in storage at the Shipwreck Artifact Warehouse in Jakarta. Now, I believe they've been in that warehouse for up to 2 decades now. It's almost 20 years, and their status is still unresolved. We did manage to, through a project I was involved in a few years ago, get some students involved in working with the objects to measure them and to learn some basic archaeological skills in object handling and measuring. So that was good use of the objects, but nevertheless, they're not open to the public in general. So we can't say that this is an intact assemblage. And there are still objects from Belitung turning up in different parts of the world. So in 2017, about 160 objects turned up in China. And they're now on display in China at the kiln in Changsha, which is the location where the bowls were made. So it is certainly not an intact assemblage, and we can't claim that it is. The anchor and hull are missing and destroyed, and there are still a number of objects in private collections. This is a really marvelous example of one of the Changsha bowls, which I go on and on about because they are so gorgeous, but this one is particularly so because, as you might be able to see, it has the Makara sea monster jumping out of the water and attacking the dhow, the vessel, with these flying fish. So there are a number of these objects in private collections. So this leads to what I call orphaned objects. And I wanted to briefly mention orphaned objects because it's the subject of a new research project that I'm working on. And the orphaned objects are the direct result of Indonesia's commercial salvage policy and the changes in the legislation over the past 4 decades. So orphaned objects, I define them as cultural objects that have been recovered unethically, illegally, or some other problematic way. So it includes underwater cultural heritage that has been commercially salvaged rather than scientifically excavated. So even though it's legal in Indonesia, it's not acceptable to the international community and certainly not acceptable under the provisions of the 2001 UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage. And it's really important to point out that convention because it bans commercial exploitation of underwater cultural heritage. It preferences in situ preservation where possible. It advocates for international cooperation. And it certainly doesn't support commercial salvage. So as a result of the means by which these orphaned objects have been pulled out of the water, determining the provenience and the provenance of these objects is difficult. So provenience is about the place of origin, where it comes from, and the provenance, so like which shipwreck site, that's the provenience. And then the provenance is about the ownership history. So which hands has the orphaned object passed through before it comes to be in this museum or in this collection or in this display. Now, orphaned objects are part of private collections. They're also in museum collections, state-owned collections. So the project that I'm working on is responding to the abundance of orphaned objects. So this is, you can see some of the objects here. This is from the Australian collection. The project brings together 2 collections, one in Australia and one in Indonesia. And this collection has about 2,300 objects in it, and they were purchased and for a long time owned by a private collector based in Adelaide, who has now donated these objects to Flinders University. And Flinders University is leading the project. We have 2 Indonesian PhD candidates as part of the project, Zainab Tahir and Nia Ridwan, who you can see there. They are both colleagues from the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries. And we're working together to try to discern the provenance and provenience of these 2,300 objects using a variety of research techniques. Now, I mentioned that we're working with 2 collections. The other collection is the one in Indonesia. Here we go. So this is the Shipwreck Artifact Warehouse, which is where the 7,000 Blutung objects have been for the past 2 decades. Now, this is a much bigger collection, over 200,000 objects. I believe it might be the biggest ceramics collection in the world. So these objects are from legal salvage, like the Blutung, that was legal salvage as part of the 50-50 split, or they have been seized from salvage companies who were operating illegally without a permit, or who were operating at a period where the legislation changed and they weren't covered by the legislation. So it's managed by the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries. And you can see some of the numbers there. About 148,000 have been declared as state-owned assets, and about 170,000 are still undergoing assessment to determine where ownership vests. So it's an enormous job, and there's a lot of work to be done in bringing these 2 collections into conversation and seeing what we can learn about one from the other. So these objects need curating, and they need caring for, curating in the purest sense of the word. They need to be conserved, they need to be protected. You can't just leave an object that has been underwater in a warehouse or in storage without taking appropriate measures to protect and preserve it. They will crumble, they will get dusty, they will degrade, they will be damaged. So this warehouse in Jakarta, on the outskirts of Jakarta in Chulungsi, really embodies the debates within Indonesia about how to understand, articulate and communicate Indonesian maritime histories. And it shows to me that the stalled nature of the debates in Indonesia has real consequences, in this case for the hundreds of thousands of objects. If you'd like to read more about the Orphaned Objects Project, we have just published an article in Marine Policy. So there's a lot more info in there about what the project entails, but it's not the main focus of my talk today. So I'm going to keep moving on and change focus to the World War II ships, which is another area that I've been working on for a couple of years now. So the first one, that should be HMS. I apologise to the Brits. It's not HMAS Exeter. HMAS is His Majesty's Australian ship. It should be His Majesty's ship, HMS Exeter. So Exeter sank in the Java Sea in 1942 after engagement with Japanese cruisers off Java, and 54 people perished, and 650 of the crew were made prisoners of war, and 152 of them later died in captivity. So it's a terrible, tragic story, and it's part of a broader story of loss and death in the waters of Southeast Asia during World War II. So in 2008, this is from the Explorers Club, I believe, from a report by Dr. Andrew Falk. And this is a screenshot of a video survey that produced this 3D impression of the site of HMS Exeter in 2008. So it's a huge ship, 8,000 tonnes, and it's almost as long as 4 Olympic-sized swimming pools, so a really big site. But they went back to the site in 2016 and conducted a multi-beam site survey. And as you can see from the results of that survey, the ship was completely gone within 8 years. So this is typical debris seen on the Exeter site. So there's no identifiable large parts of the ship remaining. And the culprits are believed to be salvage barges operating in Southeast Asia that have stolen shipwrecks in their entirety, as is the case with Exeter. And I know there are people in the room who've done more work on this than me, so I'd just like to acknowledge the work of Shanatria in particular. The next one is HMAS Perth. This is one that I have done a fair bit of work on. And again, this ship was lost in 1942. It's an Australian ship. And this is what it looked like. Sorry, I'll just show you where it's located. So it's just off the coast here, just off Bunton Bay. Perth and Houston were both destroyed by Japanese missiles and gunfire, torpedo fire. And over 1,000 men were killed between Perth and Houston in 1942. Now, when Perth went down, this is what it looked like. It was largely intact. There was a little bit of torpedo damage, but largely intact. This is based on a survey conducted in 1967, but it's more or less what it looked like when it went down in 1942. And it stayed that way for several decades. But then in 2017, the Australian National Maritime Museum, working with Shinatria and his colleagues at what was then ICOMOS, now BRIN, went back to do a site survey, and they found that less than 40% of HMAS Perth was left in place. So again, this is the illicit salvaging that we see taking place around the region, not just in Indonesia, but in maritime Southeast Asia more broadly, because of its scrap metal value. The copper tubings are worth a lot of money, for example. So if you look at the discourse in Indonesia and internationally about these salvaged warships, what becomes clear is how contested these wrecks are, and the very difficult waters that Indonesia is navigating when it comes to managing these ships legally and morally. So The Guardian pointed it out, there are different perspectives, different sides you can see the theft of these ships. Is it a deep sense of indignation, political awkwardness, or post-colonial indifference? So they really raised a lot of issues on different sides when news started to come out about the removal of these World War II shipwrecks. The Australians, it's deeply upsetting and of great concern. The Dutch also suffered the loss of a number of their ships in the Java Sea. I haven't shown you any of those images, but as this quote indicates, the Dutch ships, and certainly the Australian ships and the British ships as well, had human remains on board. So it was desecration of these human remains that many people took particular objection to. Another Australian quote, complex issue of sovereignty, legal implications, and national emotions. But then there was also the Indonesian perspective, where the flag states, the Dutch, the Australians, the Americans, had not asked Indonesia or engaged with Indonesia around the protection and preservation of the ships, despite the ships having been in Indonesian waters for many decades after World War II. And another quote from Indonesia, why didn't they guard the ships? So again, raising these challenges that a country like Indonesia, with its great expanse of maritime domain, faces in enforcing and monitoring shipwreck protection, whether it's World War II shipwrecks or 9th century shipwrecks or any other type of maritime heritage. So I just want to briefly mention this issue, which is the issues that the theft of the World War II shipwrecks raised about the ministerial hierarchies that I mentioned earlier. So shortly after the industrial scale salvage of Perth was made public, a panel of judges at the Jakarta Corruption Court sentenced the then Transportation Ministry's Sea Transportation DG to 5 years in prison for accepting bribes related to the issuance of harbour dredging permits. And the harbour dredging had been conducted to clear Indonesia's nationally strategic sea lanes. So this was in 2018, and the suggestion was that there had been some awareness within Indonesian government circles about the salvaging of warships in nationally strategic sea lanes. So we see history and heritage coming into direct conflict with issues relating to navigation rights, coastal development, national sovereignty, sea lanes of communication, security, and transportation. So this is what I mean when I say that heritage is political. Briefly turning to SS Aquila now, which I mentioned is a wreck. It's a steamship in Ambon Bay, and it sank in 1958, and it lies in waters managed by Pertamina, which, as you know, is the national oil and gas company. And so for many years, relevant Indonesian ministries, including Education and Culture, Marine Affairs and Fisheries, have been in discussion with the Ministry of Transportation about how to best manage the wreck in a way that can also accommodate Pertamina's access requirements. In particular, Pertamina wanted to build a new jetty so that they could turn their ship. During the COVID pandemic, like so many other things, these interministerial negotiations stalled, they stopped. And now it seems that the jetty has been built under the authorisation of the DG of Transportation, but without the consultation with archaeologists that we might have hoped or expected. So this recent article says that discussions got quite heated, diskusi hangat, between the Maluku provincial government and the Maluku Cultural Heritage team. And we start to see in this example of SS Aquila these hierarchies of shipwreck management, with transportation seemingly at the top and education and culture and marine affairs and fisheries further down the pecking order when it comes to decision-making around shipwreck management. And again, this sheds light on the competing priorities in terms of development, natural resource management and heritage. So let's move now to the regulatory context. We can't avoid legislation any longer. I'll try not to make it too boring for you, but I did want to mention just the global and the domestic regulatory context because it's so important in thinking about this history of commercial shipwreck salvage in Indonesia. So the first is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1982. It made some provisions for archaeological objects, but its main aim, UNCLOS, which is what I call it, the main aim of UNCLOS was to establish maritime zones. So things like exclusive economic zones, territorial seas, international waters, all came about because of UNCLOS. That's what UNCLOS did. It's one of the most popular conventions in the world. Indonesia ratified it in 1985. And it's now been ratified by 168 countries and the EU. So UNCLOS left the door open for a dedicated convention on underwater cultural heritage management through these two articles, Article 303 and Article 149. This is the only mention that UNCLOS makes of heritage or archaeological objects. And so it was really positioning the international community to fill the gap and to introduce a convention dedicated to underwater cultural heritage management. That task was taken up by ICOMOS, which developed this international charter on the protection and management of underwater cultural heritage in 1996. And that fed into what would become the 2001 UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, which I mentioned earlier. This has had a somewhat slow sign-up rate. It was introduced in 2001. It came into force in 2009. It's been ratified by 72 countries. And you can see its principles there to prevent commercial exploitation, to guarantee heritage for the future, enhance capacity building and knowledge exchange, and enable international cooperation. In Southeast Asia, the only signatory is Cambodia, and many countries, including Australia, Indonesia, and many others, have not yet signed it. So instead, Indonesia has very much charted its own course when it comes to managing shipwrecks in its waters. And we see Indonesia's approach rolling out in these four distinct phases, which I've sort of mapped out on this slide here. The first is a legal vacuum. The second is when commercial salvage was legalised. Then there was the moratorium. And then there are developments since the introduction of the Omnibus Law in 2020. Now, in walking you through these four distinct periods, I'm not asking you to remember all the legislation. Please don't feel like you have to read it. It's a bit overwhelming, to be honest. But what I do want you to take away is to think about how heritage seems to cover so many different portfolios, while at the same time somehow slipping through the cracks created by multi-agency involvement. And the effect over decades has been a situation where heritage is subject to the broader lack of interagency coordination and implementation and enforcement failures. And it's also meant that coordination efforts are largely dependent on the efforts of individuals within ministries and the political will of regional leaders. So we've got this legal void here, and the catalyst for filling that void was the Geldermalsen shipwreck, salvaged in the 1980s and sold at auction in Europe by Christie's for millions of pounds. Now, the salvager consulted with the Netherlands. This was a Dutch wreck from the late 18th century, I think, but not with Indonesia. And the case prompted Indonesia to think, well, if we want to do something like this, if we want to claim ownership and rights to shipwrecks like this, well, we need some new legislation. And in fact, it prompted the introduction of Indonesia's first shipwreck laws and also China's, interestingly. So before the Geldermalsen case, there wasn't much in place. The heritage laws dated to the pre-independence period, Dutch era, 1930s. And as you might expect, they didn't mention underwater heritage at all. So in 1989, Indonesia introduced new laws that legalised commercial survey and salvage. And they were overseen by the National Shipwrecks Committee, which oversaw the issuing of permits. The coordinating minister for political and security affairs was the chair of this National Shipwrecks Committee, and the vice chair position was held by the Minister of Education and Culture. Now, the committee was pretty big, and it just got bigger and more complicated over time. Initially, there were representatives from 9 different government ministries, including defence and security, education and culture, home affairs, justice, transport, trade, and the headquarters of the armed forces. Membership was later expanded to 15 ministries, including the Navy, the police, and marine affairs and fisheries. And in 2000, the chair of the committee actually moved to the new Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries. And also in this period, and perhaps somewhat of a contradiction, we see the enactment of the first heritage laws, this law number 5, 1992 on cultural heritage. This new law asserted state ownership over cultural heritage, cagar budaya, and replaced the heritage laws that dated to the 1930s. So what it did is it asserted state ownership over objects older than 50 years of cultural, historic, and scientific significance. But these two laws, the heritage law and the shipwreck salvage law, weren't in conflict. They enabled each other. Any potential protection offered by the new heritage law was negated by the shipwreck salvage law. And this is because of a 1992 presidential decree on profit-sharing arrangements, which allowed non-significant objects to still be sold. And what this did is it more or less ensured that any objects found on a shipwreck would not be found to be significant, so that they could be sold. And it was under this arrangement, thinking about cultural, historic, and scientifically significant objects, and how any object that didn't fit that criteria could be sold, that many shipwrecks were salvaged between 1989 and 2010, including the Belitung and about a dozen other shipwrecks, many of which are now in the Shipwreck Artefact Warehouse. That brings us to 2010, when the temporary moratorium was introduced. And this was the result of a new law on cultural heritage. So having done almost nothing for 60 years, Indonesia introduced not 1, but 2 new heritage laws within 2 decades. Now, this new law included objects on land and water, but rather than providing clarity, it seemed to just make things more complicated and to exacerbate the ambiguity around how underwater objects were managed. So on one hand, Presidential Decision 43 of 1989 over here, this is the commercial shipwreck salvage legislation. It considered shipwreck cargoes as valuable objects to be salvaged and utilised. These are terms that are not compatible with preservation or safeguarding. But on the other hand, the new law of 2010 left open the possibility that these same objects could be classified as cultural heritage to be conserved. And this distinction between objects that are viewed in economic terms versus those that are considered part of the wealth of the nation, so private wealth versus public wealth, commonwealth, it put heritage in two different conceptual categories. And the consequences were that there were different outcomes for how these different objects were managed. And the short-term effect was, because no one really knew what was going on, there was a temporary moratorium on shipwreck salvage. And this moratorium was made permanent in 2016 with this presidential regulation, number 44, which included shipwreck salvage on a list of businesses that were closed for investment. So many observers thought that that was it for commercial salvage in Indonesia. It would be no longer. But then the Indonesian government surprised everyone when they introduced the law number 11/2020 on job creation, the omnibus law. This law opened certain fields that were closed to investment. It reopened those fields of investment, and that included shipwreck salvage. And this meant, of course, that commercial salvage was back on the agenda. At the same time, we also saw laws and regulations coming in that integrate shipwreck site management into village tourism management plans. So taking heritage in quite a different direction again. So government regulation 32 of 2019, this one here, requires every province to zone their marine area either for general use, like tourism or port use or aquaculture, as a protected zone, or as a sea lane. And then the Decree 30 of 2020, this one here, issued by the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, it related to marine protected management and required shipwrecks to be protected, or provides for shipwrecks to be protected as marine protected zones, not as cultural heritage protected zones. And in fact, it was under these provisions that HMAS Perth was finally protected through a marine conservation zone, not a cultural heritage conservation zone, in 2018 by the, I think it was Susi Pujiastuti, who was the minister at the time. And there's another article I wrote about this with my colleague about this interesting convergence where not natural and cultural heritage sites are protected by different legislation, but with similar outcomes for both the natural and the cultural heritage values at the site. So the legislation is still very much in flux, and it's hard to keep up with the changes, to be honest, but it is worth paying attention or drawing your attention to this latest presidential regulation, number 8 of 2023, which regulates commercial salvage and does so by providing for objects to be managed in different ways under different laws and by different ministries, depending on their status. So to determine the status of an object, the Ministry of Education and Culture has to first assess the objects. So this takes time. There's no blanket significance on all underwater cultural heritage sites. It has to be determined through assessment. And if it is assessed as cultural heritage, then it is managed by Education and Culture under the Heritage Law Act of 2010, and it cannot be commercially salvaged. But as I said, you know, the enforcement provisions are very weak, and the result is that cultural heritage objects are not properly protected and remain, unfortunately, vulnerable to looting. Now, if the assessment finds that it's not cultural heritage, then it's managed by the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, and it is subject to the changes introduced through the job creation law. So it can be commercially salvaged. It's open for investment and can be optimised in situ, either as a marine tourism site, as a conservation area, or auctioned through the State Property and Auction Services Office. So we have this situation where shipwreck objects are managed under different pieces of law, depending on whether they're believed to be cagar budaya or not. So the fact that all shipwreck sites are not just managed under the Heritage Act, even today, says a lot about how the debates about maritime history and heritage are still playing out in Indonesia. and about the disagreements which are evidenced through this legislation about whether shipwrecks are heritage or an investment opportunity. So we've looked at various shipwrecks from Indonesia, as well as the international and domestic legislative framework, and asked whether they are cultural heritage or marine resources, and the problems that arise when they are conceptualized as both. And what emerges is a sense that these wrecks are not only not Indonesian, they're not part of Indonesia's history, but more importantly, yeah, they're not considered to be part of the story of Indonesia, despite the fact that they lie in Indonesian waters. So as far back as 1993, in a government regulation, Indonesia introduced a clause that cultural heritage objects had to have certain characteristics, and one of which, as I said, is that they had to be of great historical, scientific and cultural value for Indonesia. So what does this mean for Indonesia? What do these shipwrecks do, the ones I've talked about today and other shipwrecks, for Indonesia? So this was never defined in the legislation, but it goes to the heart of how Indonesia viewed its place in the world then, and perhaps still does today. So it's the difference between Indonesia as somewhere that enabled connection across time and space, in which the presence of foreign vessels and cargoes confirmed the centrality of Indonesia within global maritime histories. You know, it's not an accident that the Belitung shipwreck ended up in Indonesia. It was trading through these waters. This was a key part of its journey. But you know, you compare that with these sort of nationalist or even chauvinistic approaches that view only objects and vessels that come from Indonesia, that originate in Indonesia, as significant. This is a much more narrow way of thinking about Indonesian history, and it leaves out so much, and it disconnects Indonesia from its connections around the world. So if we think about the case studies that I've talked about today, it's clear that although they are not Indonesian wrecks, you know, in the sense that they're not constructed in Indonesia, they are nevertheless significant for Indonesia, whether as testament to its role in global trade in the ancient world, or in terms of the conflict and its consequences during World War II, or even in terms of how we prioritise heritage and marine habitats in relation to resource extraction and development. And thinking about what something means for Indonesia in relation to the maritime past might then lead us to think differently about Indonesian maritime futures in terms of the management of shared heritage between nations as part of broader bilateral relationships, about the building of collaborative international and domestic partnerships, about Indonesia as a strategically significant maritime nation today within the context of superpower rivalries playing out in the region, about the relationship between shipwreck management and healthy reefs and fisheries and livelihoods, and about Indonesia claiming its place as a maritime nation in a way that more adequately allows for the fullest expression of inclusive Indonesian maritime identities. I have popped up a few questions or discussion points, perhaps, if that's of interest, but I will leave it there. I know it's a lot to take in with all that complicated legislation. So happy to answer any questions, and I will hand it back to our moderator, Kumuning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pearson. This was very, very interesting presentation. So
I'm going to stop sharing if that's okay.
yeah, that's fine. Thank you so much.
If we keep stay here all the time, maybe we cannot.
Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Was I muted? Okay.
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay.
You weren't muted.
I'm so sorry. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Pearson. This was a very, very interesting presentation. And this is something that I personally never really deep into, but this is certainly something that very important to be considered for our future planning and regulations. So we still have around half an hour. So I will allow our participants to ask questions if there's any, you can raise your hand or just write down your questions in the chat box. Mbak Ratri Wulandari, please. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly? Okay.
Good morning. Hello, Natali. I'm sorry earlier. So sorry earlier about the error time. Thanks for your time. This is the second time I see your presentation. It's very fascinating. Previously, I was late and I missed half of it. But yes, I was really interested with your view of the legislation in Indonesia, actually, because I myself, I know nothing about those legislation about the marine and fisheries and the omnibus law. In fact, well, we know just in gross globally, but not in detail like you. So the first thing is, in your opinion, in your perspective about this omnibus law, is it something good? I mean, is there any opportunity for us in viewing this law, or is it more to the negative impact it will give to this maritime heritage? And the second, I also have the same question as you wrote in your slide. With so many shipwrecks in Indonesia, with the vast maritime area, certainly there will be so many ships from other countries, and ours maybe are also sank in another country outside Indonesia.
Yeah.
So this is something we haven't really considered, not in the discourse, not in our discussion. What will we do with our shipwrecks outside and other shipwrecks inside? So this is maybe a question to be answered by all of us all together. Well, that's it. Thank you.
Ratri, you're the first person to ever ask me that question about Indonesian shipwrecks outside Indonesian territorial waters. So thank you.
Thank you.
It's a really important question for Indonesia, and I'm answering your second question first about Indonesian shipwrecks outside Indonesian territorial waters and foreign shipwrecks within Indonesian territorial waters. And if we look at what China is doing, it raises really interesting issues around claim making of the maritime past through the search for and the discovery of material remains. And so China is actively looking for the remains of the Zhenghe shipping fleet, and who knows if they'll ever be successful in finding that. It's believed to be many ships, many large ships, and it raises interesting questions about if it is found outside China's maritime territory, what might the implications be for the claim making that China would make around access to those wrecks and indeed access to those marine spaces, those waters. So this is why shipwrecks are such an interesting research topic, really, because they are by their very nature mobile, and they really complicate the methodological nationalism that pervades so many research approaches, where we think about the nation state and borders and boundaries, and we think about it in terms of land. But when you're thinking of the ocean and these moving vessels transiting across marine space with flags that don't match the coastal territory that they're in, whether modern day or in the past, it really makes us stop and think about our assumptions about who owns the heritage and who has the right to it and who has the responsibility for it. I think it's very narrow-minded to think only of, let's use Indonesia as an example. I'm not saying that Indonesia does this, but to think only of Indonesian flagged vessels as Indonesian or as significant for Indonesian history. The presence of the World War II wrecks really brought this into stark relief, because these ships were there advancing a colonial agenda. And some of the pushback from Indonesia when the ships were salvaged was, well, these aren't our ships, and they were here protecting Allied interests in Indonesia. They've got nothing to do with us. But World War II did play a significant role in Indonesia. It Indonesian independence followed shortly after World War II, for example. So even though the World War II ships are not Indonesian flagged, they're Dutch flagged or Australian flagged vessels, they are still part of Indonesian history. They're part of shared history too, though, and there needs to be discussions had about how to manage that heritage. So, you know, the UNESCO Convention, which none of the countries I've discussed have signed, really places a priority on international cooperation. And I think that is so important when you're dealing with sites that are sensitive, like with human remains, or sites that have valuable objects on them, sites that are home to, you know, special fish species or whatever. And this question of who benefits from the sites and who has access to them is very interesting. Yeah. And your first question was about the omnibus law. Look, I have not read that whole law. That omnibus law, Cipta Kerja, changes 77 different pieces of legislation in Indonesia. And I've only read the part that relates to shipwrecks. As to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for shipwreck management, maybe my colleagues, I can see Zainab is here actually. Maybe Zainab, you want to jump in, but I think it came out of left field. It was unexpected that commercial shipwreck salvage would be back on the agenda. I think there are different perspectives about whether commercial shipwreck salvage being reintroduced is a positive. You know, supporters of commercial shipwreck salvage in Indonesia, including commercial salvagers themselves, argue that commercial shipwreck salvage is the only way to monitor what's coming out of the ocean, and that in the absence of commercial shipwreck salvage, as we're sort of seeing now, it's very difficult to monitor the management of these sites. So whether it's good or bad, I think I can't answer that. I think it's just becoming more complicated, and I know it's made a lot of extra work for colleagues in different ministries in implementing the relevant implementation guidelines and regulations to align with the changes in the legislation. And I imagine that's very hard work. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the wonderful discussion, Mbak Ratri and Dr. Pearson. So there's another person that's raising hand. Kata Ivankov, I'm sorry if I butcher your name, but please unmute yourself.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi.
Hey, hi, Natalie. I'm really sorry I couldn't join from the beginning. Actually, I missed most of the part, the thick of it. I did attend the previous webinar that you did, and I'm glad that I got to at least see some of the conclusions. So my question is related to, I read your a journal article about your project about reuniting orphan cargoes. And I actually live in the area close to the warehouses that you mentioned in the KKP collection warehouses in Chilewungsi. So I'm thinking, like, how are you gonna? Well, my first question is how are these objects, or these ceramic objects, deemed as kind of how did you mention them? They couldn't be really used in a sort of a exhibition context or anything like that. They were kind of commercially
they're in various stages of preservation. They do need urgent care and curation in the original sense of the term. You know, it's about exhibitions and display, but it's also about using these objects, for example, as teaching and training resources for undergraduate archaeology students, getting them to use them in developing their archaeological skills and their conservation skills, their curatorial skills. So there's lots of different ways of using the objects. But a lot of work needs to be done before that to determine ownership and to catalogue them.
It's quite a complex project, right? So how are you going to achieve this with machine learning, I suppose, to kind of track?
That's just one element of the project. Machine learning is one of the we have a specialist on the project who's going to be running that. But we're also doing a whole raft of more established techniques, you know, archival research and chemical analysis and comparing typologies across the different collections. Look, it's a hard project, but it's important work because nobody wants to touch the objects. So we're going to see what we can achieve with the objects that we have. And I think it's really important to explore that and not just to write them off as too difficult, whether for too difficult, you know, ethically, too difficult legally, or too difficult in terms of what they might or might not be able to tell us.
Right. Yeah. I do believe it's very important what you're doing because there's not many shipwreck ceramics, salvage ceramics collections that are available on display or for research. As you mentioned, there's a maritime museum that has a little bit, and yeah, there's a few bits here and there in Museum Nacional and other places, but there's not enough compared to the amount of shipwrecks.
Yeah. That's right. Well, that map. Oh, yeah. You missed my first slide, which was a recent map by Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries of all the shipwreck sites that have been identified in Indonesia, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands. And you know, if each shipwreck was carrying 10,000 objects, it is millions and millions of objects. And there is a question around, you know, what do we do with all these objects? Do we leave them there? Do we try and get the money together to excavate them? How do we protect the sites in the meantime? How do we stop them being looted if we choose to leave them in situ? It's a big problem. Yeah, it's a big project. We've got a great team working on it, but we certainly have our work cut out for us. Thank you for reading the article and for your interest in it.
No, thank you for replying.
Yeah.
I'll leave out.
Have you been to the warehouse? Have you been and had the opportunity to have a look?
I know where it is. I haven't looked because I think you need a special permission, right?
It's not open to the public.
I would love to, but yeah.
Yes, I was very excited to have the opportunity to go in last year actually. But one of the points you mentioned is that there are not many shipwrecked ceramic or shipwreck collections available for study by the public, and that is one of the really wonderful things about the purchase of the Belitung by Singapore, is that they are being cared for by, curated by the National Heritage Board, and they are accessible to the public in the public galleries at the ACM, Asian Civilizations Museum, and to scholars. I mean, there's thousands of objects still in storage, and ACM has dedicated sort of research fellowship schemes where you can apply to go and study the objects, and some marvelous research has come out of that. One of the scholars, Amanda Respes, looked at the inscriptions and looked at the conjuring of Allah through these calligraphy, these pseudo calligraphic inscriptions. So there's really great work coming out of that collection, and that's because NHB is making it possible for the public and for scholars to study them in depth.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So there's another question in the chat box. Cecile is asking, commercial shipwreck hunters are considered the bad guys in this game, but is it fair to say that they are the only ones who are able to finance the excavation? As a hypothetical example, is that wrong morally to sell 10,000 plates to private collectors in order to finance a shipwreck which has 50,000 pieces of ceramics to be displayed in a public museums?
Oh, this is such a contested topic. Sometimes I wonder why I study this topic. It's great for discussion, but you know, this is a difficult question. You know, Cecile, thank you for your question. Shipwreck excavations are very expensive, and shipwreck excavations are generally not a priority for most countries unless it's a particularly famous wreck. So you might be aware of what's going on with the San Jose in South America at the moment. That's getting an awful lot of attention. You might be aware of the investment that was made in excavating the Mary Rose shipwreck in the UK. over 30 years, and I don't know how much it cost, but it took a very long time. There's a beautiful museum, but obviously this is not possible for every shipwreck. And I don't think anyone would argue that that's what the end goal is anyway, to excavate every single shipwreck and put it on display. We need to make decisions, and sometimes they're difficult decisions about what to excavate and what to leave in situ. But your question is about this hypothetical example of whether it's morally wrong to bring up 60,000 objects and sell 10,000 of them in order to finance the rest of them being put on display in a museum. So I'm aware of this model, and it uses the somewhat unfortunate term multi-duplicate ceramics. And, you know, archaeologists will hate that term because every object is unique, right? But this is a model that was tried in Vietnam, where there were public-private partnerships, and the idea was that the government would get first pick of the unique objects, and the multi-duplicate objects could be sold in order to finance the establishment of a local museum near the shipwreck site, on the land near where the shipwreck was found. And it's an interesting model, but unfortunately what happened is it didn't work. The museums were never built. So the cargoes were recovered, they were split, and then the public was never given access to the ceramics that had been retained. So, you know, I don't really like dealing in hypotheticals, but that is an actual example of what happened in Vietnam with that particular proposition. Shanatria, do you want to jump in? I can see you're blowing up the chat here. Shanatria, I do not agree that only commercial salvage can finance excavations. Official government institutions have carried out excavations and surveys independently and have published them in international journals. So far, they have only destroyed the context and not excavation, but more looting. I don't understand your last sentence there, Shanatria, but feel free to.
Commercial salvage is not excavation, so we cannot say that excavation. It is more looting because they left the context very badly, and then we do not know anything about the context. It's only an object, and it means nothing. You know, the object is probably
devoid of its context.
Yeah, because it's loose from the context, so it's for archaeology it's meaningless. So that's my point, and I do not agree that that kind of mindset that only the commercial salvage who has money, because they're profit oriented and they didn't care about the science in it, or the knowledge, or the history even, and even the story of the shipwreck. So we can learn about it from Belitung, for example. You know, Belitung is a very important shipwreck, even the oldest one in Indonesia, but until now we didn't know nothing about it. We just know about the cargoes, the ceramics, but that's it. But the whole story, that's more important. That's only the artifacts. So that's my point. And I did my research is always concentrate on the general context, you know, in the bigger context, and then put it Indonesia role on the maritime shipping route is as an important place for in the past, or in the present, or in the future. So yeah, that's
Okay, thanks Shanatria for unmuting and sharing. Yeah, I mean, Shanatria is absolutely right. Context is everything for archaeologists. He's also right that including in Indonesia, governments have funded excavations, and there's been some really important surveys done across Indonesia by great colleagues like Shanatria and Zainab and Nia. And he's also right that there are still a lot of questions about the Belitung shipwreck and where it was made, where the timbers come from, who built it, where it was going, where it loaded its cargo, which trading route it was using. No one really has answers to this. There's just more and more questions the more you sort of pick at it. And there's a point to be made about whether that information could have been garnered if it had been scientifically excavated as opposed to commercially salvaged?
That's a very interesting discussion because as an architect myself, so I'm an architecture historic preservationist, sort of. To us, context is something that we consider the most during the conservation process. And I'm not an archaeologist, but it's kind of hard for me to understand how excavation work when you take out artifact from a certain context and then you place it in a museum and not,
Yeah.
you know, providing the overall context on where these artifacts are coming from. But yeah, this is a really interesting topic to discuss about. Is there anyone else?
Well, just
sorry.
before you go on, I think it's really important to say I'm not an archaeologist either. I'm friends with archaeologists, but I'm not a trained archaeologist. I'm a critical heritage studies scholar. So I'm coming at it from a different perspective. It doesn't mean that I disagree with the archaeologists at all. I use their data, their information, their ideas and their insights, but I'm also thinking about it from a different perspective. My background is in museum and heritage studies and history and Indonesian. So thank goodness for the archaeologists, and it's great to have so many of them here. But yeah, lots of different perspectives on shipwrecks, and I'm increasingly trying to introduce international relations perspectives to shipwrecks too, because I think they are very potent political actors potentially. Yeah.
Oh, there's another question in the chat box. Do you want me to read it or?
Sure.
Okay, so the question is from Amadea from Shaman University. I'm also a free diver based in Gorontalo in Sulawesi Island. In Gorontalo, we have one famous diving spot of a Japanese shipwreck from World War II. So far, I know in 2014 that this site has not yet been protected, while many tourists and divers always come here. It is sad to see that most people are not aware of how valuable this site is, but only see it as a tourist place that benefit for local economy. In your opinion, do you think there's anything we as local people or free divers can do to promote this Japanese shipwreck site as a protected area recognized by the government? This could have a positive impact on local tourism and help educate more people about its significance without losing the economical value of the local people.
That sounds great. Let's do it. No, the free diving, first of all, that sounds amazing. I'm not brave enough to do that. And I'd love to know if you know the name of this shipwreck that you're talking about, the Japanese one. But I think you've raised tourism, which is something I mentioned towards the end of my talk, and this increasing push that we're seeing for marine tourism to be one way of thinking about shipwreck management. Getting local communities involved in recognizing, as it seems you are expressing here, recognizing the value of the heritage in their waters and being proud of it, and you know, using those values to support protection and preservation, perhaps develop like a shipwreck interpretation trail. I don't know how deep it is, this wreck that you're talking about, but having plaques on site or on land. It is a shame that people are diving it without knowing the historical context of that shipwreck, and sounds like more could be done to develop the significance of it and share it with the people who are already visiting it, and that would probably have positive effects for income and create job opportunities for locals, and that money can be channeled back into monitoring the site. So similar to, well, I talked about HMAS Perth, the maritime conservation area was put around that one, not a cultural heritage preservation. So it's also interesting to think about your Japanese shipwreck in terms of the marine ecosystems that it might be supporting, and exploring various ways it could be protected as a maritime conservation site. Thank you for your question. I can't remember who asked it, but yeah, getting communities involved in tourism initiatives is really important.
Definitely. Pak Suhardi, do you have any questions?
Yes, thank you. Natali, we understand that only a number of major countries, many major countries have not signed the UNESCO Convention of 2001 for the protection of underwater cultural heritage. Do you know what are the reasons behind their reluctance to sign it? Do they share the similar factors with Indonesian government? Thank you.
Oh, well, before you mute yourself, could you tell me what the Indonesian government's reluctance is based on? Or your perspective on that?
Oh, my perspective, I think because I'm not a underwater cultural heritage expert, but from my observation as a heritage activist and practitioner, I think it's because we just don't understand that there should be a balance between protecting the heritage values and the economic values of any heritage. And in this case, I think our government just put a heavier values on economic benefits of the shipwreck, and just like you said, commodify it rather than the urgent task of protecting it as a heritage as a whole.
Thank you for sharing. I would love to know more about why so many countries have not signed the 2001 convention. More and more are. It is slow, but it's slowly getting there. We're up to 72. And in Australia, we have recently introduced new legislation that removes barriers for us signing. And I think that positions Australia to sign the 2001 UNESCO Convention in the near future. And I think that is certainly our intent with the new legislation. Mark Staniforth wrote a really great paper about the neighbourhood effect, which is kind of like when one country in the neighbourhood signs it, it can stimulate and prompt others to also sign it. We haven't seen that in Southeast Asia so far, with Cambodia having signed it, but no other countries. I think from memory, Mark suggests that if Australia were to sign it, it might have a stimulating effect, including in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. New Zealand might follow suit. I don't know, the legislative situation in New Zealand, whether they're positioned to do that. This all takes a very long time. But the reason I asked you what your perspective on why Indonesia hasn't signed it is because I don't know why Indonesia hasn't signed it, and I've heard different things. And one of the reasons I've heard for the low ratification rate, in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia is it's due to the maritime disputes in the South China Sea and questions around maritime security and sovereignty over waters, maritime territory in disputed waters. So that might be another reason. Even when the convention was being drafted, there was a lot of disagreement between the parties involved because of concerns that it would encroach on different zones as specified by UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and that countries would have their sovereignty affected as a result. I think France was very reluctant in the development of the 2001 convention, but has subsequently gone on to sign it, actually. So there is some progress being made, and maybe it's just a matter of different countries getting comfortable with it in the neighbourhood, as Mark Staniforth suggests. But there's certainly a lot of legislative reform that would have to take place still in Australia and in other parts of the world. Yeah. I mean, compare it to UNCLOS, which is the constitution of the sea. Someone described it like that. It's very, very popular. Everyone signed it. But when it comes to heritage in the ocean, the countries are much slower, much more cautious. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Natali.
Thank you.
So we only have a couple of minutes left. Pak Mukhtar, if you want to briefly ask your questions.
Thank you very much. I live at Natuna Island. at Natuna Sea, beside South China Sea. My question: how to harmonize or managing the local wisdom for the stretch at the future beside the potential conflict of South China Sea.
So your question is how to harmonize local wisdom with some of the tensions that you're seeing in the South China Sea?
Yeah, relationship with our title today for webinar.
I'm not sure I completely understand your question, but I do know that Natuna is at the forefront of some of the concerns or tensions around claim making in the South China Sea. And I'm also aware, as we mentioned earlier, that communities have a really important role to play in protecting, guarding maritime heritage.
In managing underwater cultural heritage, I mean. How to harmonize the local wisdom in managing underwater cultural heritage.
So, are you aware of the Liberty shipwreck in Bali? Have you heard of this one? Have you heard of Liberty shipwreck in Tulamben, Bali?
No, I stay at Natuna Island.
Yes, no, I understand you're in Natuna, but the Liberty shipwreck is an interesting example
Not yet.
of the community guarding, advocating, managing a shipwreck in their waters. Even though it's an American shipwreck, they have taken custodianship and they manage it through local laws because I think it is Indonesia's most popular shipwreck snorkeling diving site. It brings a lot of money to the community, and so they are very invested in looking after the shipwreck and making sure it will be a sustainable source of income for the future for them. I can see Zainab has her hand up. Zainab, do you want to unmute yourself, because I imagine you might have something to say about this? Hi.
Hi, it is good to see you. Hi everyone. Yeah, I heard you mention my name when it comes to whether omnibus law is bad or good law. But I will skip this this point to the last. And about Natuna, we did a survey in 2017 in several areas. The Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries conducted a survey in Natuna Island, and also the Ministry of Culture. So we identified several more than 10 underwater cultural heritage sites, and later on, the local government proposed to change the status of the local protected area into the national protected area. They proposed it because of the number of shipwrecks found in Natuna Sea. So what I want to say is there is an effort to incorporate the protection of the underwater cultural heritage sites in Natuna into the marine protected area. So there is a local protected area around Natuna Sea, and the local government proposed to increase the level of protection from local to the national level. And in this point, we need to check to confirm to the local government the progress, the updated for this for this proposal, because of the authority it should go to the provincial level to apply or to propose to the Ministry of Marine Affairs to change the status of the protected area. And that's the first point. And the second point,
Zainab, I'm sorry, I think we're close to the limited time. Can you just
okay.
quickly?
Okay, and for related to the community base, Natali pointed out in the presentation about the policies. There is a tourism village development, marine tourism village development. It is these regulations. We can come through this regulation for to optimize of our local community-based management for heritage. We did a program, several programs involving local communities. In I think until now we have six areas involving community to manage them to manage the shipwreck sites, including in Karawang. Yeah. I think naturally bad and good, I will skip it. It depends on the perspectives. But oh, it is so hard to it is too hard to answer. But in the context of underwater cultural heritage, as Natali mentions, Indonesia's policy is not that simple to say whether it is bad or good. There is a lot. There is some ambiguous. There is a contradictive. There is dualistic approach involving several ministries. If I can say, the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Marine, the place that I work, and so we need an extra session to discuss about this. But surely that we need a really serious concern about protecting underwater cultural heritage and how we can make it through a better and effective policy making. I think ICOMOS Indonesia would be very much can really has a effective role to initiate a discussion about this. Thank you.
And perhaps even a lobbying role or an advocacy role, Zainab. That's a really great point to end on. We're giving ICOMOS some work to do. But this question of legislative harmonization, which has also come up in the chat, you know, Australia has been wrestling with this for many years, and we still don't have it right. There's still a lot of issues in terms of how our federal government and our state government manages heritage in different marine zones. You know, we're going back to UNCLOS again. There's disconnects and there's overlaps, and there's a lot of smart people working on it in Australia, and they're still trying to figure it out. So it's you know, a legacy thing with this legislation developing over many years, priorities changing, information changing. So Indonesia is not alone in facing this challenge of having legislative complexity and ambiguity. There's a lot of work to be done. And I think ICOMOS is well placed to advocate on behalf of better protection and preservation through legislative harmonization is one way of doing that, and supporting capacity building initiatives and research and you know, student education, all that sort of thing. But thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you. I think it was a good discussion, and I'm really privileged to come and speak with my colleagues in Indonesia. And I wish you all, those who celebrate, happy Idul Fitri for next week.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pearson. Thank you, everyone, for the wonderful, insightful discussion. I am sure everyone here learned a lot. And we came into the end of our session today. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Pearson, to be here and to spare your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hope we can keep collaborating in the future and keep connecting.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pak Suhadi. Thank you, Kamuning, for lovely chairing. And thank you. Where's she gone? I think Ratri. Oh, no, Ratri's still there. Thank you so much, Ratri, for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Natali.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Natali. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
to all participants. Looking
Thank
forward
you
to meet
very
you all
much,
again in
Miss
our next
Natali.
webinar.
Thank
See
you,
you all.
Mukta. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kamuning.